She is a tech reporter, acclaimed storyteller, sought-after public speaker, and CEO of the award-winning digital media firm Reify Media. Across the globe, she has led keynotes and training sessions on cutting-edge tech trends and innovations, resonating with audiences of all backgrounds and experience levels. She's known for her rare ability to explain complex tech topics with humor and data-driven insights. Here's Dr. Sarah Glova.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea. I am so excited to be here to share a newer talk that I have called Stop Giving Women Advice, the Science Behind Unsolicited Advice. Now, before we dive into the research that I want to share with you, since it is the science behind it, I thought we could do an experiment together. Y'all up for an experiment? It's a pretty easy one, and you can stay seated. Okay, I got more nods that time. So imagine in this thought experiment that we're going to a new coffee shop. It's a beautiful coffee shop. It's one of those like rare local ones. As you're getting closer to it, you can smell these like freshly baked goods. You can just tell that the baristas know what they're doing. You know what I mean? Okay, so we're walking up there together. Can you picture how you're feeling walking up to this coffee shop? How do we feel? Excited? Can I hear another one? You want to get a beer? I don't know if they serve beer, but it's our dream coffee shop, so let's say they do. Okay. So now imagine, we're going to continue our experiment here. Now imagine as we go to this coffee shop, we open the door, and right away, someone comes over and says, hey, I've been here a lot. I've ordered every drink they have, and I know exactly what you should get. It's the most popular one. You should order this. And then they kind of walk away. Okay? They didn't really ask if we want coffee or tea or beer, but okay, whatever. But now imagine we go back a week later, and a similar thing happens. We push open the door, someone comes over and says, hey, I see that you've got a laptop bag with you. I come here a lot, I work here a lot. The best place to sit is actually, it's over there. It's a lot quieter. You should go over there. Okay, thanks. Now imagine we go again and again. 7 times we go, and this happens. We walk in, someone comes over and gives us some advice. So my question to you is, imagine we're going to go an 8th time, and you're walking up to this coffee shop, and you know as you're walking up that on the other side of that door, you're likely to get a piece of advice. How do we feel? I heard a couple things at the same time. What was the one over here? How do we feel? Tired. Ooh, I like that one. Tasered. Ooh. Stop. Yeah, this person is not coming with me an 8th time. They're like, Sarah, pick a different coffee shop. Okay, interesting. So if we do an experiment and we compare, when we were going to this coffee shop at first, we were excited. We were hoping they had beer. Now we feel tasered. We're not even going anymore. I can't even bring you to this coffee shop. What happened? Because the advice actually wasn't that bad. It was, here's the most popular drink. Here's a place you can sit. So what happened? I do this experiment a lot, and I get different responses. And I will tell you, there are some people who are like, I would just ignore them and go get my latte. And then I've heard other people who say, that would make me so stressed out, I would be so annoyed, I would never go back. So your experience is unique. Your experience with advice is unique. But we see in the research that a lot of people feel some pretty serious reactions to unsolicited advice. We see in the research that when you receive unsolicited advice, you can feel a sense of judgment, as if you're being judged. You can also feel stressed. There's some research that shows that depending on our relationship, if you give me advice that I was not asking for, I can feel like a fight or flight reaction. It's like an approaching tiger is coming because you've told me where I should sit in a coffee shop without me asking. It's a pretty intense reaction. And I don't want to pick on unsolicited advice because there's something interesting about solicited advice too. It's not neutral. We see in some studies that when someone asks for advice, they see a dip in their confidence. Their confidence actually lowers temporarily just from the act of asking for advice. This is so interesting because advice is really common. How quick are we to be like, well, you should try keto, or download this app, or take a different route next time, or have you tried telling your boss this? So if it's not helpful to receive advice, and it can even hurt our confidence to ask for advice, who is advice for? It's for the person giving advice. We see in the research that when you give it to someone advice, you feel a sense of power within yourself and influence over others, even when that advice is not taken. Simply the act of giving advice can give you that sense of power and influence over others. And there's an interesting lens that I want to talk about today, and that's gender. So in some studies that I saw, there were examples where they looked at who gives who advice, and one of them looked at kids giving advice to their parents. And they found that when kids give advice to their parents, they're much more likely to give it to mom than they are to give it to dad. There was another study that was really fun. It looked at examples of advice. It called it tokens. So how many times were tokens passed around in a co-ed dorm? And they found that men were really likely to give women advice. Women were not very likely to give men advice. And the men would often give advice to the RAs, so the leaders in that space. Women almost never did that. So overall, women are receiving a lot more advice, but a lot of studies show they're more hesitant to give it. So based on what we've seen, when we look at how unsolicited advice makes us feel, women have more opportunities to feel that judgment, that stress, and fewer opportunities to feel that sense of power or influence. Now, the last thing I want to share with you tonight is this phrase that I'm now in love with, and it's, what have you tried so far? So I was giving a talk a couple weeks ago about leadership, and I had a young woman approach me afterward. And she said, I'm new to leadership, I love what I do, but I just get so nervous speaking up in meetings. And my heart just broke for her, and I wanted to give her the world. I wanted to sit her down and tell her everything I knew about how she could, calm herself down. I wanted to tell her about my favorite breathing exercise. I wanted to help. But I have seen the research about advice, and so I paused. And instead, I said, oh, man, I can relate. Well, what have you tried so far? And she said, well, I'm a yoga instructor, so I found that a couple poses helped to calm me down. Y'all, I almost told a professional yogi that she should try intentional breathing. And if I had, what would that have been like for her? To go up to someone and say, I'm having trouble with this, and for that person to then say, well, you should try this thing that you already do. And then maybe she thinks, well, okay, maybe I'm just not good at this then. Instead, we had this beautiful conversation where I was like, that's amazing. I do a breathing exercise. That sounds pretty similar. When I get nervous, I do that. And she was like, you still get nervous? And I was like, absolutely. If you care about something, I think it's pretty natural to get nervous. What do you think? And we had this beautiful conversation. Remember, her asking for advice, we know from the research, could have lowered her confidence a bit. And me responding with advice might have given her a sense of judgment or stress. So knowing what I know about advice now, I try as often as I can to swap it out with curiosity. Now, I want to leave you with an experiment of your own. This is a bit like buying a yellow car, and then you see all the yellow cars. Now that I've told you about advice, that's like the yellow car. You're not going to be able to talk to people this week without being like, stop giving me advice. There's all this advice. It's like you're going to see it now. So I hope you'll open up to that and pay attention to how often it comes up in conversation, how often you find that you want to give some advice, how often you're receiving it. And I hope you'll try the experiment of responding with curiosity rather than advice. And if you do, I would love to hear how that goes for you. Please feel free to stay in touch and share your experience. Thanks, y'all.
Questions for Dr. Sarah Glova?
Thank you for that interesting information. I'm puzzled by it. Is it because the difference between male and female, how they perceive or give advice, is it coming from genetics? Or is it coming from the culture and societal parameters?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have to share anecdotally, Andrea was walking the microphone over to the table where my husband is sitting, and I thought he raised his hand. I thought the question was coming from you, and I'm really glad that it wasn't. Thank you for being here. Love you so much. I really appreciate your question because it gives me the chance to share a lot of this research. It was based here in the western part of the world. I think that there are significant cultural differences, and that would be something to pay attention to in the research. For your question about why this is occurring, and does it have something to do with like the male or female brain? Based on what I've seen in the neuroscience, when we're looking at how our brains and how our bodies react to advice, the only real difference that we're seeing in the physical structure and the physical responses of brains and bodies is that they are sometimes different sizes. We're not seeing that like females have an extra thing that makes them not give advice or receive more advice. So physically, and if we're looking at that part of it of like the brains by gender, we're not seeing it there. It's more a cultural thing. We see really interesting studies where we look at things like how often we perceive that women speak up. And there's a study that shows that we perceive women to be speaking up more than men. If they speak up, I think it's like 35% of the time or something. It's really low. I'd have to look up the study for you, but we perceive them as speaking up the majority of the time when they're not, even if they're just speaking up. So I think culturally, it's more accepted for men to give advice, and that's seen as like thought leadership, whereas for women, and this is a lot of personal belief here, I think that women can be perceived as bossy for doing things like that. So I think it's more of a cultural difference than like a physical or biological reaction. Great
One
question.
last
Thank
question
you.
over here.
Wonderful talk. So my question is, how helpful is advice? That you assume you run an experiment, somebody knows about a maze, they tell somebody what they know about the maze. That would be really helpful. Yeah. Does that pan out in real life?
Yeah, I love this question. Thank you for that. And thank you for saying that you enjoyed the talk, because I've never given it with so many men in the room ever. So thank you so much. Wasn't nervous about that at all. So what I use as a metaphor when I share this in leadership training is I use the metaphor of arsenic. Like, we got to be really careful with arsenic. We don't mess around with arsenic. But it has uses. Like, we use it. It has medicinal purposes. It has purposes in products. It can be helpful. We don't want to interact with it every day, but it can be helpful. I would never say no advice ever, but we have to be really careful with it. And an analogy that's helpful for me is the arsenic one, because it reminds me that it's almost toxic. If you are a firefighter and you see me putting a car seat into my car incorrectly, and you know that children have been injured or have even died because of the mistake that I'm making, I hope that you will intervene and give me some advice. In that instance, the danger of potentially making me feel stressed or judged definitely is not outweighed by the health and life of my child. That being said, I walk into a coffee shop and you have a favorite drink and you think I should try it and I don't know you, bro, you might want to keep that to yourself. Like, that's not the same. And I think we have to remember, it feels really good to give advice. So it's hard for us to remember that it doesn't feel as good receiving it. And so I hope that it's fun in the next couple weeks to just practice and see how often you notice it, and maybe experiment with changing your relationship a little bit. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Dr.
Thanks, y'all.
Glova.